Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Robin Gates and I'm a fantasy author. Today I'm reading my short story He Who Hunts the Dead, a story that takes part in the fictional world of Runland, a world that I created several years ago and about which I wrote several novels in the German language. So this is my first attempt to write a Runland story in English. Have fun. He Who Hunts the Dead. If someone had asked Berenda whether he had been spoiled by success in his long life, he would probably have roared with laughter about such a stupid question. He had survived 3 wives, fathered twice as many children, not counting the bastards with servant girls who didn't count as heirs, and thanks to his skills as a warlord, he had secured his clan's supremacy over the province of Norad in the north of Runland. Not a bad life for the son of destitute farmers who had ruthlessly fought his way up to the throne. But had he been happy in all those almost 60 years? This was a question which no one had ever asked him, least of all he himself. Frowning, he stared from his bedroom window up at the moon. Its thin blade cut through the night. He could have sworn that just 2 days ago the bright light of the full moon had shone down on the wooden palisades of his stronghold. But the silvery sliver which hung high up in the late autumn sky indicated an early new moon. Thoughtfully Berenda scratched his grey stubbly beard, slipped into his tunic, and put on his heavy boots. He almost knocked over his chamber pot, which he had just half filled when he had been woken by the need to pass water. He was weary of his family and the damn quacks they sat on him for months now, treating him like someone seriously ill. Something was wrong here, and he would get to the bottom of it. Determined, he opened the door to Corvin's chamber. His son would tell him the truth, but the room was empty. Berenda's unease grew while he strode through the stronghold and peered into one room after another. What by all ghosts was going on here? Where had everyone disappeared to? He stumbled into the courtyard of the stronghold. It was deserted as well. The maidservants, his guards, all of them were gone. Even the stables were completely empty. No, not completely. Coming from the box at the very back, he heard a pounding. He looked inside, and a relieved smile lightened up his face. Arsan was still here, faithful old mount. He stroked him, while the horse's head joyfully pushed against his shoulder. At least one living being had remained in the stronghold. Berenda saddled Arsan and led him into the nightly courtyard. He put on his leather armor, which he hadn't worn for over 3 years, tightened it around the midsection, and girded his sword. Maybe he was a sick old man who was barely able to climb into the saddle, but he would find out what the heck was happening here. If Khan Sidal was completely deserted, then he simply had to ride to the next settlement. Surely some farmer had seen where his family and the garrison of the stronghold had headed off to. When he took the reins, he heard the sound of wings. Something dark emerged from the gloom of the night into the light of the burning fire pit in the courtyard. Berenda caught sight of a pitch-black bird, as big as a buzzard, which landed on the firmly stomped clay ground. It was a fully grown raven. Fearlessly, the animal hopped close up to Arsen's hoofs. Its deep croaking resounded through the silent yard. The flames of the fire ducked down as if under a blow, and sprayed sparks. A shiver ran down Berenda's spine. He remembered his nurse telling him as a child that if one had such a feeling, then someone would have just walked over one's grave. On a whim he bent down to the raven, which regarded him with its crooked head, and without flinching. "Well, what kind of message are you bringing, black fellow?" He registered how hoarse his voice sounded in the deserted courtyard. "Can you reveal to me where everyone has vanished to?" The bird opened its big beak. The feathers as its throat spread out, it let out a hard "grah," which actually sounded like an answer to the question of the grey-haired old man on top of his horse. At the same time, it hopped backwards a short ways and let out another deep croak. Surprised, Berenda winced. Had the animal understood him in the end? Did it want to show him something? He steered Arson towards the raven, which flew up at once, just to settle on the palisades over the open gate, and croak once more at the bewildered clan chief. "All right," Berenda muttered, as if speaking to himself. "Following you isn't any more foolish than just riding out into the night chancing my luck. Show me the way." The raven on the palisade eyed him intently, uttered another cry, and soared into the air. Outside the stronghold, it landed on the field road that led out of the enclosure. Berenda let Arson bear down on it. But shortly before Arson could reach it, the bird flew up, only to flutter just far enough away that it didn't disappear into the nightly darkness entirely. This way, it led the rider farther and farther along the path, which ran through the open country for a while, until it approached a wooded hill, which looked like the skull of a bald giant with a thick fringe of hair. Berenda knew the area well. From time immemorial, the hill was called the Height of the Dead. Legend had it that a long time ago, the Dark Elves, who had dominion over the north of Runland in the old days, had fought a battle high upon the peak of the hill, even though nobody could say any more against whom. Some reckoned it would have been monstrosities that had come from the depth of space. Others stated that the Dark Elves had raised weapons against their own brothers and sisters. The corpses of the elven warriors and their enemies had been buried on the battleground. Nothing grew up there anymore since then. Berenda's winged leader disappeared between the first beeches in the underbrush. Warily looking around him, one hand firmly laid around the hilt of his sword, the other holding the reins, the old warrior entered the blackness of the forest. It was darker here than on the open field, and louder too. The autumn wind blew in gusts through the crowns of the trees, made the dried leaves whisper, and even let the thicker branches groan. The raven was nowhere to be seen or heard. With every further step on his horse up to the peak of the Height of the Dead, Berenda felt more uncomfortable. He had never been a fearful man. Fear wouldn't have brought him to the top of his clan, but never before had he felt such a distinct feeling of being in a place that didn't bid him welcome. But nevertheless, he steered his horse further ahead. He wanted answers, and no monster or ghost would keep him from getting them. He had hoped that this oppressive feeling of a threat would end once he was outside the forest, where the branches seemed to grip at him with knotty fingers. But it was just the other way around. Berenda had barely left the wood when the wind, now free of any barrier, swept over the bald hill range in heavy gusts and yelled loudly in his ears. Deeper down on the fields, it hadn't been anything but an unavoidable part of the autumn weather. But here, up on top of the Height of the Dead, it lent its voice to a chorus of lost souls. It cried out loud as if in deepest despair. Then it abruptly descended to the coarse whispering of someone ill with fever, only to laugh unexpectedly like the wild screaming of shapeless lunatics accusing life for not being able to find rest. The thought that under him, in the damp earth, laid the bones of the dead Antara sent chills down the old clan chief's spine. Suddenly another noise mingled with the howling of the wind, the muffled drumming of paws in a swift run. He spun around. Behind him, something huge and shadowy on four paws darted out of the underbrush into the low grass of the hill range and directly at him. Out of the corner of his eye, Berenda noticed even more movement. The first shadow had already reached him and jumped up snarling at Arson, who went up on his hind legs, shrilly whinnying so that he almost unseated his master. Now Berenda recognized what he was faced with. Icy fear hit him unexpectedly with the force of a punch. He didn't understand what it was that scared him. In the past, he had fought against more fearsome adversaries than a huge shaggy hound. Only with the greatest effort he was able to wrestle down his panic. His sword darted out of his sheath. A deep growl escaped from the throat of the hound, which glared at Berenda out of glowing eyes and whose teeth snatched at him. The old warrior's blade whipped down but missed the charging hound by a hairbreadth. Berenda attempted a second blow, when something punched him hard between the shoulder blades and yanked him out of the saddle. Hot pain shot through his left side, where he hit the ground. His hand groped for his sword in vain. Behind him he heard Asa neighing and galloping away into the forest, in sheer panic, pursued by the black hounds. The hound which had thrown him from the back of his horse had jumped upon him with its full weight. Its ugly head hung deep over Berenda's face. Drivel dripped onto his cheeks. The rolling eyes of the huge beast glowed in their sockets like embers fanned by the wind. The hound's fur reeked sickeningly of decay and rotten wet leaves, as if the shaggy mud had dug itself out of the depths of the soil onto the surface. But the worst of all was the icy fear that the eerie animal exuded, like the stench of a predator. Berenda felt as if this fear wedged him into a vice which squeezed the air out of his lungs and robbed him of his strength. Never before he had been in the grip of such a terrible panic, but he had never given in to his fear. And this time he wouldn't do it either. His hands laid themselves around the throat of the hound, which thrust forward to reach him with his teeth and stemmed against its weight. The muscles of his brawny arms, old but still sturdy, tensed up. An ugly, hollow crack sounded, and the rumbling noise deep in the throat of the black hound fell silent. Berenda rolled the animal off himself onto the ground, where it stayed with twisted neck. Lying on his back, the old warlord panted. Breath rose from his mouth in clouds. Suddenly, he felt the ground on which he was lying begin to tremble under a multitude of rapidly nearing hoofs. Berenda was so exhausted that he shortly played with the thought just to keep lying there, regardless of what would appear next on top of the height of the dead. But again, the old fighting spirit that had fired him through his whole life spurred him on. Painfully, he stood up and grabbed his sword, which by now felt twice as heavy. When he looked up, his breath faltered. A group of approximately 30 or 40 riders emerged from the forest and bore down on him. But that wasn't the most terrifying about them. The riders, as well as the horses, seemed to be shaped out of moonlight. Silvery, shining spectres. Behind the half-translucent shapes, Berenda could see the forest surrounding the hill range, but the thundering battle roars with which they charged at him weren't shadowy at all. It was impossible for him to dodge this wild troop or escape from it into the underbrush in time. Berenda knew that he was beaten. Well, at least he died as he had always wanted to, on his feet and with a sword in his hand. He stood where he had raised himself from the grass and awaited the ghostly riders.